our studies in the Gospel of Mark, we come today to chapter 2, verses 8 to 22. It is, as we will see, a slightly puzzling passage, but before we study it together, I would like to read it to you. Mark writes, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, 'How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?' Jesus answered, 'How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse, and no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins.'" But before we proceed, first a reminder. We now know that Mark wants to persuade us that the man Jesus of Nazareth was and is the one promised by God as the person who would finally and fully sort out the mess into which the entire human family had fallen as a result of sin. And in order for Jesus to do this, Mark makes the outrageous claim that Jesus was God, God incarnate, God in a human body. He knows he sounds crazy, but he hopes that we will be ready to listen to his evidence for these claims and not make a premature decision about them. And so far he's offered us several accounts of incidents in Jesus' life that Mark thinks might just begin to make his claims seem a little bit more plausible. However, Mark has also warned us that those who had custody of the religious traditions of Jesus' time, the scriptures, or what we know as the Old Testament, scriptures that had been designed by God to prepare them for Jesus' coming, were far from enthusiastically welcomed by the Pharisees and their disciples. Now, in the previous study, we also noticed that the second half of chapter 2 contains 3 stories of the opposition Jesus encountered from these Pharisees and his response to them. Thus, in our last study, we noticed that Jesus taught that these religious leaders had failed to understand that their scriptures were not intended to promote religion, but prepare people to welcome him. So what additional point does Jesus seek to teach them in our present passage? The occasion of Jesus' teaching is clearly stated by Mark. He says, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, 'How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?'" Religions universally have taught that there are occasions in which people may or even should abstain from their usual eating habits and focus upon spending more time before or seeking God. So the question that's asked of Jesus is not an unreasonable one. However, once again, his reply is both mind and life-blowing. It's also typical of Jesus. So those who are familiar with the sayings of Jesus will know that he often answers a question by not answering it, or more accurately answers it by asking a further question, which addresses a profounder issue than the one originally raised. Almost invariably, his reply comes with the implied question, "Who then do you think I am?" That, I suggest, is true here. So Jesus' first response is a further question. He says, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them?" He then answers his own question by adding, "They cannot fast so long as they have him with them, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. On that day they will fast." Now, Jesus is clearly implying here he's some sort of bridegroom. But to understand exactly what he is saying, we need to consult the Old Testament scriptures. Those writings that, as we've already seen, were both his authority and that of his opponents. In the Old Testament, the relationship between God and his own people was one often seen as analogous to that of a bride and groom. If you're interested to follow up some of these references, you might see among others Isaiah chapter 50 verses 1 and the following verses, Isaiah 62 verse 5, Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 32, and Hosea chapter 2 verse 1. These passages and other similar ones are sometimes called eschatological. This is a big word used by theologians to say that such verses look forward to the messianic age, when God will reign on earth through the one he had promised, the one sent, as we have already seen, to sort out the human mess. So against this background, Jesus is making an absolutely astonishing claim. He is claiming to be God, present in his world as the groom with his bride, and the one who brings about the messianic age, delivering humanity from the sin that holds them captive. While Jesus seems to recognize that there is a place for fasting, his emphasis here is that the messianic age is one that should be an era of profound joy. In other words, the fact that he has come into the world changes everything, and life is to be centered on living appropriately in the light of the fact that the promised Christ has come. Jesus will later teach us that his coming is in two stages. Once he came and began to establish his kingdom. That was now 2 millennia ago. But he will return to finally and visibly establish his rule over all. So we live in the tension between two ages, what has sometimes been called the present and the not yet. And this often brings great grief and pain, yet Jesus is here saying that since I've come, I make a world of difference. Thus he reminds us a characteristic mark of genuine Christianity, or indeed true religion, should be a deep sense of joy, because Jesus, the Messiah, has come. The second part of Jesus' reply to the disciples of the Pharisees seems naturally to follow from his first illustration. He has been speaking about a marriage, and now, after briefly giving an illustration from needlecraft, he turns to discuss the preparation of wine which is almost universally flowed at marriage celebrations. For those familiar with winemaking, Jesus' illustration is self-evident. As the fermentation process takes place in the early stages of wine production, the wine requires space for this fermentation to occur. When the wine is fully matured, however, this is no longer required. Where this process took place within leather vessels, the bottles would harden with the maturing of the wine, and that would cause no problem. However, to put new fermenting wine into stiff leather bottles would inevitably lead to disaster. So Jesus' illustration is clear enough, but what is the point that he's trying to make? In the context in which he's speaking, he would appear to be making another point about the Messianic age and contrasting it with the past. But what is he contrasting? Now, clearly there's nothing wrong with wine that has aged. In fact, connoisseurs tell us that it's often the best. And wine that is still fermenting is actually usually undrinkable. Similarly, there is nothing intrinsically better between an old and a new bottle. The point, therefore, must be that certain actions are more appropriate at the different stages of the process of wine production. But again, we ask the question, what then is Jesus' point? And I think in the context, it's most likely that Jesus is now contrasting the period before he came with that which follows, which is inaugurated, the age of the Messiah. Now, we already know that Jesus had the highest respect for the Old Testament scriptures. In fact, he's already shown that he believes that they point forward and prepare for him. But a new age had now dawned in him. And to try, as it were, to return to the past and ignore the realities of the present new era was bound to be disastrous. I believe very simply Jesus is challenging the Pharisees and saying to them, a new day has dawned, so you need to conduct yourself accordingly. I'm the one who's introduced the new final age of God's plans for the world, plans that have been promised for centuries. Welcome me, and don't simply live as though I have not come. This can only bring disaster upon you. As we conclude today's study, we're brought face to face with the fact that Mark's extraordinary claims are no more than a repeat of what Jesus himself taught. Jesus picks up on the promises of the Old Testament scriptures, which he so revered as the words of God, and applies them directly to himself. He claims to be the great prophet, the final word of God to a world in a mess. He claims to be God incarnate, the God who has appeared to establish his rule over his world. To fail to grasp this, he tells the Pharisees, and indeed us, is to make a mistake of immense proportions. But to catch a glimpse of what he says transports us into a new world of lasting and joyful celebration. Once again, we'll need to continue reading Mark so that this picture can be filled out for us and some of our questions answered. But here, right at the beginning of his teaching ministry, Jesus offers us all a tantalizing sight of a present and future which cannot surely do anything other than warm our hearts.